Hi everyone, long time no see, but less of a long time no see than last time, so, a win is a win. Um, when I was on here a few months ago saying that I wanted to start making videos on this platform again, I did mean it, but I did not have a plan, and I have been hemming and hawing, trying to make a plan, but I've given up on the idea of a plan. So I do have an idea for some videos. And that idea springs from an interaction that I had on social media, which, similar to most of my interactions on social media, came about with very little thought on my part. I put out a tweet saying that I'm seeing way too many people saying they're losing hope because they aren't seeing change. But the truth is that there are no shortcuts to change. It requires long hours of work, scheduling meetings, making phone calls, creating spreadsheets. And I wasn't trying to be a Debbie Downer. I actually was trying to encourage people that change is possible. Change just doesn't come by itself. But it wasn't interpreted that way or read that way by very many people. The general public, and I would say people who probably consider themselves activists but not organizers, like this person, who, I'm going to read this quote tweet. They said, "I'm sorry, but this isn't how important change happens historically. It sweeps through society in disruptive waves. It isn't directed by a project manager from an office." And that's just unequivocally false. But not only is it false, right? It's also a dangerous idea to put out there, but it's also a dangerous thing to believe, because if people are just sitting around waiting for change to sweep through society, then they're not going to do anything to bring change about. So I wanted to tell everyone some stories. I think a lot of times when we're talking about change in society, we talk about the why and we talk about the outcome, but a particular special interest of mine is always the how. So I'm going to tell you the stories of how some important changes have happened historically. Some of them have happy endings, some of them have very unhappy endings, and some are still kind of up in the air, but I think they're all important. I'm going to start with one of my favorite stories, okay? So, bear with me here, All right. So I'm going to begin in 1994. Well, the story doesn't begin in 1994. I'm going to begin in 1994. That's kind of the point, right? Okay. So in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement was coming online. And on paper, it was great, right? And in general, in the press, to people in America and Canada, it sounds great. Who doesn't love free trade, right? But Mexico's participation in NAFTA was the catalyst for the Zapatista uprising. People categorized this as just a rebel uprising. The Mexican government said that it was stirred up by foreign agitators, professional agitators, paid agitators. And in history, and I think in a lot of places where the story is told, it's told as something that was spontaneous or reactionary, but that's actually not true. The story of the Zapatistas begins all the way back in the 1960s on college campuses. In the 1960s in Mexico, as in lots of other areas around the world, college campuses were a site of major protests. People were ready for change. They didn't like their government. They didn't like the decisions it was making. They didn't like the way people were being treated. They were advocating for better working conditions, better living conditions, better treatment for indigenous populations and the working class. And the federal government saw these protests as, in their words, the result of professional agitators involved with foreigners. And their response was violent. The Mexican government's response was very violent. The president at the time, in 1966, made a speech, and he said, Neither claims of social and intellectual rank, nor economic position, nor age, nor profession, nor occupation grant anyone immunity. I must repeat, no one has rights against Mexico. Now, that same president, a few years after making that speech, who was a CIA informant, he assumed responsibility for the student massacre that led to the end of the student protests in Mexico. And this massacre was orchestrated by the government, it was planned, and students died. So as a result of this, young people considered the legal channels of political participation closed, and a lot of people stopped being politically active. We can maybe parallel this with the university protests that happened in the last few years, that were crushed really quickly by the government. You can see how that just dissolves. But there were people who came out of these protests even more galvanized to fight back against their government. These were college students. These were mostly leftists. And they said that if you're going to fight with violence, then we're going to fight back with violence. And a lot of them tried to create little, I don't want to say little, they were small. They were like groups of 20 people or less, armed organizations, and they wanted to literally overthrow the government. I'm sure that there are, I don't have personal knowledge of groups like that in the United States, but I'm sure there are many. Feds I don't know anything, okay? Anyways, those groups were summarily also crushed by the Mexican government. They kind of dissolved the way all leftist organizations have in history. Internal conflict, people snitching to the feds, and a lot of these people were captured and tortured and jailed, and some were executed by the state. And by the early 70s, this small guerrilla movement was also squashed. But there were still people who had come from the campuses to the armed guerrilla movements, and now were in a place where they said, we have an authoritarian government, we're being repressed, and they said, what can we do? And later they said that they reflected that they had failed because they didn't have a solid political base, and they had no real organization, and they were improvising an armed struggle, basically. So, no solid political base, and no real organization, and improvising. Does that sound like change sweeping through a society with no organization? Maybe. Anyways, so 6 people who came from the college campuses, literally some of them had Marxist zines in the 60s and 70s. In 1983, 6 of these people entered what is, I'm not just calling this, it literally is the jungle in Mexico. And they went in thinking, in their own words, we went in thinking we would be a vanguard, but the diverse populations were not interested in being led by outsiders, by intellectuals. They told us, we want what you have to show us, we like what you're talking about, but we do not want to be led. This happened again and again. So, as you can imagine, 6 kids, well, I guess they're not kids right now, 6 people, college-educated Marxists, going in, trying to form a vanguard party among indigenous populations in villages, working-class people, people who have never had access to education or healthcare or any of the other perks of an established society, who have been completely repressed by their government. Of course the response is going to be, we don't want you to lead us and we don't know what you're talking about. So the organizers said, we learned very early on to listen instead of talk. We changed our approach to walking while asking questions. They called the approach a rearguard movement that listens and asks questions instead of employing the Leninist strategy of a vanguard party that puts forward well-designed programs and theories and solutions. Okay, so they rejected vanguardism in favor of radical democracy. And they spent the next 10 years organizing. They say that their organization is organized horizontally, which means they don't have leaders. They are governed through assemblies. And these assemblies are not elected. People in the villages serve on the assemblies in a rotating basis. So at some point, everybody has been in the assemblies. Everybody has made decisions for the group. So they traveled through the country, right? And before they could build these assemblies, they had to organize the people. They held meetings with people, all sorts of people, it says. The idea was to listen, and when I say it says, I'm quoting from interviews that they've given. This is an interesting thing about Zapatistas. So frequently when they give interviews, okay, let me rewind. The whole thing with the Zapatistas is the collective, not the individual. That's the reason why you'll see them wearing like face coverings, bandanas, because they don't want an individual to stand out. Now you might have heard of Subcomandante Marcos, who being like the front person of the Zapatistas. He didn't love that. He didn't want that. I mean, whatever. But when they give interviews, typically, people will come as a panel, and they'll each share pieces of their story or their experiences. So I can't read a quote that's from someone specifically. They don't like to have like specific attribution. So that's why I'm not like saying so-and-so said this, right? They speak as a collective voice. Okay, I don't remember what I was saying. As I digress. Okay, so they say we traveled through the entire country and held meetings with other people in struggle, all sorts of people. The idea was to listen to each other and to find the commonality in diversity. We had meetings with housewives and factory workers, people in churches, people who would never meet each other, and we found the commonality in the oppressive system. We began to help people see the country through the lens of resistance and struggle. The job of us as organizers became finding the bridges between our different struggles. So these people, they spent 10 years organizing. They spent 10 years building connections to communities with groups, with indigenous groups and working class groups and the proletariat, I guess. And building connections and building bridges and helping them see that their struggle was one struggle. And I'm sure that they made plenty of lists and scheduled plenty of meetings. And I bet that they would have loved a spreadsheet. Okay, the Zapatistas would have loved a spreadsheet in 1985. Let's see. They said, Zapatismo is not attempting to inaugurate or lead any kind of resistance, but rather facilitate the meeting of resistance and allow it to form worlds outside of exploitation. Okay, Zapatismo poses the question, what is it that has excluded me? What is it that has isolated me? And each place we went, the response was different. We simply stated the question and stipulated that response be plural, that the response is inclusive, and that we could connect with each other in our response. So the particulars are not, I mean, they are important, but the point I'm trying to make is on 17th of November in 1983, 6 college-educated Marxists went into the jungle in the mountains of Chiapas, and 10 years later, an army of thousands came out of the jungle. As of 2005, 300,000 people reside in the autonomous zone that is governed by the Zapatistas. So from 6 people to 300,000 people, I think is very impressive. Now, the thing is that when people look at the Zapatistas from a modern lens and from, your typical socialist lens, or even like just a Western lens. I love to say lens, apparently. People say that they weren't successful, but I think that we aren't judging them by the proper metric, because they did not want to come out and conquer Mexico. They did not want to take over the government. Their plan, their goal, was to inspire other people to do what they had done. They wanted other people to build those connections in their communities. I mean, they didn't want to become what they were trying to fight, right? They wanted each group of people to have their own determination, and they wanted to connect the struggles so that they could all work together. So by their metric, they did not fail. Everyone else has failed to model their organization strategy, which I think makes perfect sense. I mean, if they aren't trying to conquer, then they shouldn't be judged as failing by not conquering. Anyways, this is actually not what I'm wanting to say. So what I want to say is that the Zapatistas were successful in what they were trying to do, but they also prove my point that change does not just sweep through society. One, because there was collectively almost 30 years of political, the basis of the political thought forming, and then 10 years minimum of organizing, really diligently organizing towards one goal. But also, all of these thousands of people modeled to other people in Mexico and other people across the world what could be done, right? And their movement did not continue to sweep through society because the organizing out there had not been done. So I think the change this is like proof, in my opinion, that the change can only sweep as far as the organizing has been done, right? So people still, I still, whenever I can find an interview given by someone, who's in the autonomous zone or is a Zapatista, I still am inspired, and I still love to hear about the things they've done. It's really incredible. If you ever have time, or if you're ever interested, to look into the way that they build school systems and medical systems and all kinds of things. They reclaim the land. They built systems where they are farming the land collectively. They also are having issues with the cartels because the government's refusing to give them any assistance, but that's a story for a different time, and probably not one that I would tell. That should be told by the people experiencing it. But I have no idea what I was trying to say. Oh, yes. So I don't know. I think I would call this one still up in the air, because the Zapatistas are still out there. They're still working hard. They're still organizing. 300,000 people. That's not nothing. That's something. I don't know. I think I've made my point. I think I'm just mumbling now. So, yeah, this is the first story I wanted to tell you. I think it's one of the most inspiring stories. The horizontal method of organizing is something that I am consistently trying to incorporate into any organizing work that I do, and I think that if we kind of layer that on top of the United States, it's something that could be incredibly useful, because we do have extremely diverse populations in this country. And I'm not just talking about ethnicity or race. People who live in rural areas have very different issues than people who live in cities. Someone who lives in Florida has different issues than someone who lives in Colorado. But we all can find a shared struggle and we don't all have to be willing to follow one leader. And I think that's something that not a lot of people subscribe to, but I think it's useful to think about. That's also a story for a different day. Okay. If you're still here, excellent work. You have a great attention span, and you're extremely good at listening to me ramble. Next time, I'm going to tell you a story that's not so happy, but also really demonstrates the power of organizing. So